My family told me my grandmother was a disgrace who abandoned her own children. They hated me because I looked just like her. For years, I believed them and carried her shame. But then I found her secret diaries hidden in the dusty attic. And on my grandfather's 80th birthday, in front of everyone who had ever judged me, I finally read the truth aloud. Before we open that diary, I'd love to know, where in the world are you right now? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's go back to the beginning of this story. To be born with my grandmother Lillian's face was, in my family, to be born with an original sin. It was a curse I had carried for as long as I could remember. At every family gathering, at every holiday, the same scene would play out. A well-meaning great-aunt would look at me, her head tilted, and say, "Goodness, Margaret, she looks more like your mother every single year." And my own mother, Margaret, would give a tight, pained smile and reply, "Let's hope the resemblance is only skin deep." The words were always followed by a brief, awkward silence, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the great shame in our family's history, the story of the woman who had simply walked away. The cruelest cut, however, always came from my grandfather, Arthur. He was the patriarch of our family, a man everyone revered for his stoicism and strength. But his strength, when it came to me, was a cold, hard, and unyielding wall of ice. He never spoke to me unless he was forced to. He would look at me, and his eyes, old and clouded with a bitterness I couldn't understand, would look straight through me. It was a rejection so total, so absolute, it had shaped the very core of who I was. I was the living, breathing reminder of the woman who had broken his heart and disgraced his name. The official family story, the one that was passed down like a cautionary tale, was simple and brutal. My grandmother, Lillian, had been a beautiful but selfish and flighty woman. One day, 50 years ago, when my mother was just a little girl, Lillian had packed a single suitcase, walked out on her loving husband and her 2 young children, and was never heard from again. She had, they said, abandoned them for a life of freedom, a life without the burden of a family. She was a ghost, a specter of shame that haunted our every gathering. The injustice of it was a constant weight on my soul. I was being punished for the sins of a woman I had never met. I was the scapegoat for a grief my family had never properly processed. The beginning of the truth came from a place of endings. My mother had decided, after decades of avoidance, that it was finally time to clean out the attic of the old family home. It was a hot, suffocating day in August. The air in the attic was thick with the smell of dust, cedar, and time itself. It was a graveyard of forgotten things, all of it covered in white sheets like small, lumpy ghosts. "Just get rid of all of it," my mother had said, her voice full of a strange, bitter resentment. "I don't want any of her things in this house another day." Her things, my grandmother's things. We worked for hours, sorting through dusty boxes of old clothes, yellowed photographs, and stacks of old magazines. My mother was ruthless, tossing decades of history into large black trash bags with a grim satisfaction. I, however, felt a strange sense of connection to this ghost I had never known. I found a small box of her favorite books, her name, Lillian, written in a beautiful, elegant script on the inside cover. It was near the end of the day, as I was moving an old, heavy travel trunk, that I noticed it. A single, loose floorboard tucked away under the eaves. My heart gave a sudden, curious thump. I pried the board up with my fingers, and there, in the dark, hidden space beneath, was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary. I knew with a certainty that was almost electric whose it was. I slipped it into my own bag, my back to my mother, my movements furtive, my heart pounding. I felt like a thief, but I also felt like an archaeologist who had just discovered a priceless hidden tomb. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened it. The pages were filled with my grandmother's beautiful, looping handwriting, and as I began to read, the ghost I had known my entire life, the villain of my family's story, began to dissolve, and a new woman, A woman of intelligence, love, and a profound, heartbreaking sadness began to emerge. She wrote of her deep love for her children. She wrote of her growing loneliness in a marriage to a cold and controlling man. And then, as I turned the pages, the story took a darker turn. She wrote of her discovery, of her husband, my grandfather Arthur's, long-running secret affair with her own sister, my great-aunt. She wrote of the confrontation, of his cold, unapologetic admission, and she wrote of his final, cruel ultimatum. He had given her a choice. She could leave quietly, pack a bag, and disappear. And he would tell the world that she had abandoned him. He would allow her to be the villain to save his own pride. Or, if she tried to fight him, if she tried to expose his affair and file for divorce, he would use his wealth and his power in their small town to destroy her. He would paint her as an unfit, hysterical mother, and he would ensure that she would lose custody of her children and never, ever see them again. The final entry in my grandmother Lillian's diary was a testament of a mother's ultimate heartbreaking sacrifice. "He has taken my future," she wrote, the ink slightly blurred as if by a tear. "He cannot have my children's as well. I will not subject them to a public war, to a battle that would tear their world apart. And so I will go. I will become the villain of their story if it means they can have a peaceful life. I will let them hate me if it means they can be safe. I am not abandoning them. I am trying, in the only way I have left, to save them." I closed the diary, my body racked with sobs. The story my family had told me, the story I had believed my entire life, was a lie. A cruel, vicious lie designed to protect a guilty man and to condemn an innocent woman. My grandmother wasn't a disgrace. She was a hero. And her own husband, the patriarch my family so revered, was the true villain. My mother's words from the attic echoed in my head. "I don't want any of her things in this house." A cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. My mother saw a box of junk, but as my fingers closed around the cool, worn leather of the diary, I knew I was holding something else entirely. I was holding the truth, and I had a feeling it was a truth my family did not want told. The final entry in my grandmother Lillian's diary was not an ending, it was a beginning. The beginning of a cold, righteous fury that burned away the last of my own passive acceptance. I spent the next few days in a self-imposed exile, the diary my only companion. I didn't answer my phone, I didn't go to work, I just read and reread her words, absorbing the full, tragic scope of her sacrifice. I traced the elegant loops of her handwriting, the occasional telltale smudge of a teardrop, and I felt a bond with this woman I had never met, a bond that was stronger and more real than any I had with the family I saw every week.
She was not the flighty, selfish villain of their stories. She was a poet, a thinker, a woman of deep and profound love. Her entries were filled with tender anecdotes about my mother and uncle as small children. She wrote about my grandfather, Arthur, with a heartbreaking, youthful passion that slowly, over the years, curdled into a quiet, confused sadness as he grew more distant and cold. And then came the final, devastating entries, the ones that chronicled his betrayal with her own sister. She wrote not just of the heartbreak, but of the calculated, chilling cruelty of his ultimatum. He had weaponized her love for her own children against her, forcing her into an impossible choice: stay and fight and see her children ripped apart in a vicious public battle she could not win, or leave silently and allow herself to be painted as the monster, preserving their innocence at the cost of her own name. She had chosen the latter. She had chosen to become a ghost so that they could have a home. My silent sacrifice, the lifetime of enduring their cold shoulders and whispered insults, now seemed laughably small in comparison to hers. I had been carrying the weight of a false shame. She had carried the weight of a true and terrible injustice. The world outside my apartment continued on, oblivious. A week after my discovery, my mother, Margaret, called. Her voice was full of a brittle, manufactured excitement. "Rose, honey, you are not going to believe the news. The family has decided to throw a grand party for your grandfather's 80th birthday. A real celebration. It's going to be at the country club. Everyone is going to be there." I held the phone, the diary resting open in my lap. I could feel my grandmother's ghost in the room with me, her silent story a stark contrast to the loud, false one my family was about to celebrate. "We really want you to be there, Rose," my mother continued, her voice taking on a slightly pleading tone she used when she wanted to appear magnanimous. "It would mean the world to your grandfather to have his entire family there, to celebrate his long, wonderful life." His wonderful life. A life built on a lie. A life built on the ruins of his wife's reputation. The hypocrisy of it was a physical, nauseating thing. In that moment, I could see my future with a terrible clarity. I could continue to be silent. I could go to the party, stand in the back, and watch them toast the integrity and honor of a man I now knew to be a cruel, manipulative fraud. I could allow my grandmother's true story to remain buried under a floorboard in an attic forever. I could carry this secret, this poison, with me for the rest of my life, just as she had. Or I could do something else. I thought of her final, heartbreaking words in the diary. "I will let them hate me, if it means they can be safe." She had made her sacrifice to protect her children from the immediate blast of a scandal, but 50 years had passed. My mother and uncle were no longer children. The danger was gone. All that remained was the lie, a lie that had been allowed to fester and poison our family for 2 generations. A lie that had been used as a weapon to hurt me. My grandmother had sacrificed her own truth for her children's peace. But I realize now, my loyalty was not to their fragile, ill-gotten peace. My loyalty was to her and to her truth. "Rose, are you there?" my mother asked, her voice tinged with impatience. My decision was made. It was not a decision born of anger or revenge. It was a decision born of a profound, quiet, and unshakable sense of duty. I was the custodian of my grandmother's story now. I was her voice. "Yes, Mom," I said, my own voice, calm and steady. "I'll be there. I wouldn't miss it for the world."
After I hung up the phone, I didn't feel anxious or afraid. I felt a strange, cold sense of purpose. The party was not just a party anymore. It was a tribunal, a final court of family opinion, and I would be presenting the star witness. I spent the next week preparing. I went through the diaries, my work as a researcher lending me a methodical precision. I did not choose the angriest passages. I chose the most truthful, the most heartbreaking, the most undeniable. I marked them with small, discreet tabs. I chose the entry where she first writes of her suspicion. I chose the entry where she details his cold, cruel confession. And I chose the final, devastating entry where she explains the impossible choice he has forced upon her. I bought a new dress for the party, a simple, elegant black dress. It was the color of mourning, but also the color of quiet, undeniable authority. The night of the party, as I got ready, I felt my grandmother's presence with me. I was not just doing this for her. I was doing it for myself, to free myself from the shadow of the woman I was supposed to be, and to finally, fully embrace the spirit of the woman I truly was, Lillian's granddaughter. I placed the small, worn, leather-bound diary into my purse. It felt heavier than a book. It felt like a stone, a cornerstone for a new and more honest foundation for our family, whether they were ready for it or not. They were all going to gather to celebrate a hero. But tonight, for the very first time, they were going to hear the real story. And it was a story that had been waiting 50 years to be told. The ballroom of the Oak Haven Country Club was a monument to my grandfather's ego. A massive, professionally printed banner hung above the stage, bearing a handsome, smiling photograph of him from his younger years, with the words, "Arthur Pendleton, 80 years of integrity, family, and leadership." The irony was so thick, it was almost a physical presence in the room. A live jazz band played softly in the corner, and waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently through the crowd of over 100 guests, his business associates, his golfing buddies, and our entire extended family. I stood in the back of the room, a ghost in a simple black dress, the small, worn, leather-bound diary a heavy, secret weight in my purse. I was an observer, watching a play I knew by heart. I saw my mother, Margaret, flitting from group to group, accepting praise for what a wonderful father she had. "He was always our rock," she heard her tell a cousin, especially after Mother left. "He held us all together." I saw my cousins and aunts, all of them smiling, laughing, and completely oblivious to the lie that had formed the very foundation of their family. And I saw him, my grandfather. He was seated at the head table like a king, accepting the tributes of his loyal subjects, his face a mask of noble, patriarchal benevolence. He was the hero of this story, a man to be celebrated. The speeches were an exercise in surreal, agonizing hypocrisy. An old business partner stood up and toasted Arthur's unshakable integrity and honor in all his dealings. My uncle gave a rambling, emotional speech about his father's steadfast loyalty. And then my mother walked to the podium. She spoke of her childhood, of the sudden, inexplicable darkness that had fallen over their home when her mother, Lillian, had abandoned them. She spoke of her father's strength, of how he had raised 2 small children on his own, of how he had protected them and held the family together in the face of such a devastating betrayal. "He was both a mother and a father to us," she said, her voice thick with tears that I now knew were for a completely false narrative. "He is, and always will be, my hero." The room erupted in heartfelt applause. My grandfather dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. I just sat there, my hand resting on my purse, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. The performance was almost complete. Finally, it was my grandfather's turn to speak. He stood up slowly, leaning on a cane, and the room fell into a reverent silence. He thanked his friends, his children. He spoke of his long, successful life. And then, his eyes, those cold, familiar eyes, found me in the back of the room. "And I see my dear granddaughter Rose here," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried across the room. "A young woman who, I am told, looks more like her grandmother every year." A few guests chuckled. "A beautiful girl," he continued, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "Let us all pray that she is blessed with a more loyal heart than the one Lillian was given, and that she chooses a more honorable path in life." The insult, so public, so personal, so deeply rooted in the lie he himself had created, was the final spark. This was it. This was my cue. The room was filled with a brief, awkward silence, the guests shifting uncomfortably at his strange, harsh words. It was the opening my grandmother had been waiting for 50 years. I stood up. My movement was quiet, but in the silent, expectant room, it was a seismic event.
Every head turned to look at me. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, my voice surprisingly clear and steady. It seemed to ring with a power I didn't know I possessed. "That is the perfect introduction. Since you've brought up my grandmother Lillian and her honor, I thought this would be the perfect moment to share some of her own words on the subject." A wave of confused murmurs went through the crowd. My mother's face was a mask of pure, horrified panic. "Rose, no!" she mouthed silently at me. "Sit down." I ignored her. I walked calmly from the back of the room, down the long aisle, towards the stage. I felt a strange, out-of-body calm, as if I were being guided by a force outside myself. I reached the podium, where my grandfather was still standing, his face now a thundercloud of confusion and rage. I didn't look at him. I placed my small purse on the lectern and pulled out the small, worn, leather-bound diary. For those of you who don't know, I recently found my grandmother Lillian's diaries, hidden away in the attic. They tell a very different story from the one we've all been told. I opened the diary to the first tabbed page, and I began to read. "October 12th, 1973, I read, my voice clear and unwavering. "I saw him with her today, my Arthur, with my own sister, Eleanor, in the park. I thought it must be a mistake, a trick of the light, but the way he looked at her, it was the way he used to look at me. A part of my heart, a part I did not know could die, died today." A collective sharp gasp went through the room. I could see the descendants of my great-aunt Eleanor staring, their faces pale with shock. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth. My grandfather just stood beside me, his knuckles white where he gripped the lectern. I turned the page to the next tab. November 1st, 1973. I confronted him. He did not deny it. He was not sorry. He was cold. He said he had made a mistake marrying me, that he and Eleanor were soulmates. He told me I had two choices.
I took a deep, shuddering breath and continued to read my grandmother's last, heartbreaking account. Choice 1. I could leave. I could pack a bag, walk away, and never look back. He would tell the children and the world that I had been unfaithful, that I had abandoned them. He would let me be the villain of the story to protect his own name. Choice 2, I could stay and fight him for a divorce, and if I did, he promised he would use his money, his power, his influence in this town to utterly destroy me. He would paint me as an unstable, hysterical, and unfit mother, and he would ensure I would lose my children and never, ever see them again. I finally looked up from the diary. The room was a sea of stunned, horrified faces. My grandfather was no longer looking at me. He was staring out at his friends, at his family, his carefully constructed legacy being dismantled, word by painful word, before his very eyes. I turned to the final tabbed page. "And this," I said, my voice now thick with an emotion I couldn't contain, was her final entry. November 3rd, 1973. He has taken my future. He cannot have my children's as well. I will not subject them to a public war, a battle that would tear their world apart. And so I will go. I will become the villain of their story if it means they can have a peaceful life. I will let them hate me if it means they can be safe. I am not abandoning them. I am trying, in the only way I have left, to save them. I closed the diary, the soft thud of the leather cover echoing in the dead, silent ballroom. I looked directly at my grandfather, at the old man who had built his life on the foundation of a good woman's sacrifice. That, I said, my voice now a quiet, shaking whisper, was her final honor. The honor of Lillian Pendleton, a woman who sacrificed her own name to protect her children from yours. "Happy birthday, Grandpa." I placed the small, worn diary gently back into my purse, my work now done. I turned and walked off the stage, my steps steady and sure. The silence in the grand ballroom was a living, breathing thing. It was a silence composed of 100 different emotions: the stunned shock of the guests, the dawning sick horror on the faces of my relatives, and the profound, world-shattering implosion of the man who was still standing at the podium, my grandfather, Arthur. I did not need to look at him. I could feel the weight of his ruin from across the room. The crowd parted for me as I walked towards the exit. No one spoke. No one met my eye. They just stared, their faces a mixture of awe and terror, as if I were a ghost, a specter of long-buried truth that had just risen in their midst. I walked out of the ballroom, out of the opulent country club, and into the cold, clean air of the night, leaving my family behind to drown in the truth I had just poured over them. The fallout, as I heard it later, was immediate and catastrophic. The party, of course, died in that moment. The guests, horrified to have been part of such a raw, painful, and deeply personal family execution, fled into the night, whispering and scandalized. The family, the one my grandfather had held together for 50 years with the mortar of his great lie, did not just fracture, it exploded.
My great-aunt Eleanor's children, my cousins, were the first to confront him, their faces white with a rage born of a newly discovered, multi-generational shame. Their own mother had been a party to this betrayal. Their family history was forever tainted. My mother, Margaret, did not defend her father. The shock of the revelation, the sudden, horrifying recontextualization of her entire childhood, had broken something deep inside her. She had spent her life resenting the mother who had abandoned her, all while idolizing the father who had been the true villain all along. The grief for the mother she had never been allowed to know was, I was told, a terrible and devastating thing to behold. The days and weeks that followed were a quiet, painful unraveling. The story of what had happened at Arthur Pendleton's 80th birthday party became a dark legend in our small town. My grandfather, the revered patriarch, the man of integrity, became a recluse, a prisoner in his own large, empty house, his reputation shattered beyond repair. I did not hear from any of them at first. The silence was a welcome relief. Then, about a month later, a single, hesitant phone call. It was my mother. Her voice was small, broken, a voice I had never heard from her before. She did not make excuses. She did not try to defend her father. She just wept. And through her tears, she asked me a single question. "The diaries," she sobbed. Can I please read them? I need to know her. I need to finally know my own mother." That was the beginning of our own fragile, painful, and ultimately beautiful reconstruction. We spent hours together, reading my grandmother Lillian's words aloud, crying together for the woman we had both lost, she to a lie and I to time. We were no longer just mother and daughter. We were two women discovering the truth of our own history, and in doing so, we were discovering each other. Our first act together was a pilgrimage. We drove to the small, neglected cemetery on the other side of the county where Lillian was buried. Her grave was marked by a simple, plain stone, with only her name and dates. It was the grave of a woman who had been forgotten. We spent the entire afternoon cleaning it, pulling the weeds, and planting a small garden of her favorite flowers, roses and lavender. A month later, a new headstone arrived, one I had commissioned with the money from my own savings. It was made of beautiful, warm, white marble. Beneath her name, I had them carve a new epitaph. It did not speak of vengeance or betrayal. It simply said, "Lillian Pendleton, a beloved mother, a woman of unbreakable grace, Her truth finally told. My vindication was not in my grandfather's downfall. It was not in the fracturing of my family. My vindication was in that simple, powerful act of restoration. I had cleared her name. I had given a voice to the woman who had been silenced for 50 years. In the year that followed, with my mother's blessing, I worked with a local university press to have my grandmother's diaries published, not as a scandalous tell-all, but as what they truly were, a poignant, beautifully written memoir of a woman's life in a bygone era, and a powerful testament to a mother's impossible, sacrificial love.
The book's launch was a quiet, respectful event at a local library. My mother sat in the front row, her face full of a quiet, peaceful pride. My grandfather was not there. He was living out his final days alone in his big house, a prisoner of the 50-year-old truth he had tried so hard to bury. As I stood at the podium, reading a passage from my grandmother's diary, I finally understood. I had spent my life feeling like an outsider in my own family, an echo of a woman I was told to be ashamed of. But I was not an echo. I was a continuation. I had inherited her face, yes, but I had also, in the end, inherited her strength, her resilience, and her quiet, unshakable integrity. I hadn't just reclaimed her story, I had finally, fully claimed my own. An absolutely unforgettable story about how the truth can stay buried for decades, but never forever. What do you think of Rose's decision to reveal the secret so publicly? Let us know your thoughts on this incredible family drama in the comments below. If you were moved by this powerful story of a granddaughter's quest for justice, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more satisfying stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.